I still remember the sound of church bells that morning. They weren't loud or joyful the way wedding bells are supposed to be. They sounded hollow, like echoes of something beautiful that had already died. I stood outside the old stone church in Amsterdam, my hands trembling inside my coat pockets. The winter air stung against my face, and yet my heart felt strangely numb, as if it had stopped beating hours before. People were walking in, smiling, adjusting their ties, carrying flowers. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that I was supposed to be the groom that day, but I wasn't. I could still see her through the window, Isabella. Her white dress shimmered softly under the morning light. She looked like a dream I had once held in my hands, but had woken from too soon. Beside her stood Mr. Harrington, tall and silent, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. And in that quiet gesture, I saw everything control, pride, and a father's final command. People often ask me what betrayal feels like. It's not always loud. It doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it's the silence, the heavy kind that fills the room when love is replaced by decisions made in gold and power. Sometimes betrayal is watching the woman you love walk down the aisle, toward someone else, while your own father stands beside her, giving her away. That's how my story begins. Not with a proposal or a promise, but with a moment that broke everything I believed in. I once thought love could change people, that if I held on long enough, if I stayed true, the world would understand that honesty and loyalty were enough. But that morning in the Netherlands, standing under a gray sky that refused to shine, I realized something cruel in a world ruled by money. A poor man's love is often invisible. I didn't cry that day, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was too deep for tears. I just stood there, watching the woman I loved walk away with my father's blessing. And as the church doors closed, I whispered to myself, one day they'll know what love truly costs. Before all of this, before the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the silence, there was peace. There was a small bookstore by the canal where I worked part-time after university. The air inside always smelled of old paper and rain, unquiet. Days I'd sit by the window, watching people pass by with umbrellas, their reflections dancing on the wet cobblestones. It was a simple life, and I liked it that way. I wasn't rich. I lived in a small apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread woke me up every morning. My mother used to say that love grows best in small spaces where hearts are closer and words matter more than things. I believed her. Then Isabella walked in. It was a Friday afternoon. I remember because the sunlight hit the glass just right, and for a moment the whole place looked golden. She came in wearing a pale blue coat, her hair slightly tangled from the wind. She was looking for a book. Letters to a young poet. Her voice was soft, but it carried something I couldn't name. Loneliness, maybe, or curiosity. When our eyes met, something in the world just slowed down. We started talking about books, about travel, about how the rain in the Netherlands always feels like it's trying to tell you something. She laughed when I said I liked gray days because they make people gentler. And in that moment, I saw something genuine in her, something that didn't belong to the world of luxury she came from. I didn't know then that she was the daughter of Mr. Harrington, one of the most powerful men in Amsterdam. To me, she was just Isabella, the girl who smiled at old poetry and found warmth in silence. Our love grew quietly. Evenings by the canal turned into walks through the city. We'd stop by the flower stalls, where she'd pick white tulips and tuck one behind my ear, laughing at how serious I looked. She said I reminded her of the kind of men her father didn't believe existed anymore. Men who worked with their hands, who said thank you to waiters, who found joy in little things. I thought that was a compliment. I didn't realize it was also a warning. When she finally told me who she was, I froze. I had heard of her father, the billionaire who built his empire from steel and money, who controlled businesses across Europe. He was the kind of man who spoke in investments, not emotions. Isabella told me he wouldn't approve, but she said it with a defiant smile, the kind of smile that made me believe love was stronger than anything else. So we kept it a secret for a while, meeting in quiet cafes, writing little notes, dreaming of a simple future where no one could tell us we didn't belong together. But secrets have a way of finding light. The day Mr. Harrington found out about us, everything changed. He invited me to dinner at their mansion, the first and last time I would ever step foot there. I remember standing in that vast marble hall, surrounded by silence so heavy it felt alive. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me with eyes that seemed to measure my worth in numbers I didn't have. He asked me simple questions. What do you do for a living? What are your plans for the next 10 years? How much do you earn? I answered honestly, maybe too honestly. When I said I worked at a bookstore, he smiled, not kindly, but with that quiet amusement rich men have when they look at something fragile. And then he said the words that still echo in my mind. Love is a luxury, son, one you can't afford. Isabella defended me that night. She said love didn't need permission. She said she'd rather live in a small house with me than in a mansion without meaning. Her voice trembled, but she meant every word. Harrington didn't argue. He simply stood, placed his napkin on the table, and said, "We'll see." That "we'll see" became the start of our quiet war. For months he tried to pull her away, sending her abroad for business, surrounding her with wealthy men who could offer her more than I ever could, but she always came back. She'd find me at the bookstore, her eyes tired, but full of the same gentle warmth. She said I gave her peace, something her father's world never could. And for a while, I believed that love alone could win. I believed that hearts, when true, could stand against power. I was wrong, because love isn't always lost in storms or fights. Sometimes it dies quietly, under the weight of choices made in fear. And I didn't see it coming. The day Isabella told me her father wanted to meet again, I thought maybe he had changed. I thought maybe he'd finally seen that I truly loved her. I couldn't have known that he was preparing something far more cruel, something that would test not only my love, but my very faith in people. When Isabella told me her father wanted to meet again, she was nervous. Her hands trembled as she held her cup of coffee, tracing circles on the table. The small cafe where we sat was warm, filled with the soft hum of rain tapping against the window. "It's different this time," she said softly. He wants to talk about us." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that maybe, somehow, her father had realized that love wasn't something you could measure in wealth. So I smiled, reached across the table, and took her hand. "It's okay," I said. "Maybe he's ready to understand." She nodded, but her eyes told me otherwise. That night, I ironed my best shirt, the one I wore for rare occasions. It was simple and plain, but it was all I had. I remember standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing what I might say to her father. I told myself I wouldn't let pride get in the way, that I'd be calm, respectful, and honest. When I arrived at the Harrington estate the next evening, the place looked different. Last time it felt cold and heavy. This time it was quiet, too quiet. A servant led me through the grand hallway to a small study. Filled with books and dim golden light, Mr. Harrington sat by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand. He gestured for me to sit. "Ethan," he began, his voice smooth and steady, "you seem like a decent young man." That word seemed stung more than I expected. He continued, "My daughter speaks very highly of you. She says you're kind, honest, hard-working. I respect that. But kindness doesn't build a future, Ethan. Stability does." I nodded quietly. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not here to insult you. I just want you to understand what kind of world Isabella comes from. She's used to certain things: comfort, protection, status. And whether you like it or not, love fades when life becomes hard. You may think you can protect her, but can you? Truly." I didn't know what to say. Every word I tried to form felt small in that enormous room. "I may not be rich," I said finally, "but I'll never stop trying to give her the best I can. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll make her proud." He smiled faintly, not in approval, but in pity. "I believe you mean that, but love is not built on effort alone. It's built on equal ground. If you truly love her, you'll prove it, not with words, but with wisdom." Then he stood, offering his hand like a man closing a deal. "I have a proposal for you," he said. That night, Mr. Harrington offered me what he called an opportunity. He said there was a position available at one of his companies, a logistics branch in Rotterdam. The salary was generous, the benefits even more so. But it meant moving away for at least 6 months. He called it a chance to grow. I called it what it truly was, a test. When I told Isabella about it, she frowned. "He's trying to separate us," she whispered. "Maybe," I said. "But maybe if I take it, he'll finally see I'm serious." She looked at me for a long time before saying, "You don't need to prove love, Ethan. You just live it." But I took the job anyway, not because I wanted to impress her father, but because I wanted to give her a future she wouldn't have to defend. I told myself it was just 6 months. We'd call, we'd visit, and we'd make it through. At first, we talked every night. She'd tell me about her days in Amsterdam, about how she missed the bookstore, the canals, the quiet walks. But over time, the calls grew shorter, the messages slower, and sometimes, when I called, her phone would ring endlessly without an answer. I tried not to let it consume me. I worked harder, saving every euro, imagining the life we'd build once I returned. But something inside me began to shift a quiet fear, an unspoken distance. Then, one evening, after 3 months, Mr. Harrington called me. He sounded unusually friendly. "Ethan," he said, "you've done well. I'm proud of your progress. Why don't you come back for a weekend? Isabella has news." My heart leaped. I thought maybe it was good news. Maybe he'd finally accepted us. I took the first train back to Amsterdam. When I saw Isabella again, something about her felt different. Her smile was still gentle, but her eyes seemed distant, as if part of her had already drifted away. We walked by the canal that night, just like old times. The air was cold, and the city lights reflected softly on the water. "I missed you," I said. She nodded, but didn't meet my eyes. There was a long silence before she finally spoke. "My father thinks I should marry soon," she said quietly. The words hit me like a stone dropped in still water. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard right. "What do you mean?" We're already planning," she interrupted gently. "He believes waiting longer will only make things harder. He says love should come after stability, not before it." I felt my throat tighten. "And what do you believe?" She hesitated. Her lips trembled slightly before she whispered, "I don't know anymore." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every thought, every memory of us felt fragile, like glass I was trying not to drop. I realized then that her father wasn't just fighting me with words. He was fighting me with time, with silence, with the quiet pressure only a parent's power could create. Over the next few weeks, Isabella grew colder. Not unkind, just distant, polite, careful, restrained. She still said she loved me, but it sounded like something she was trying to convince herself of. And each time I looked into her eyes, I saw fear, not of me, but of losing her world. Then came the letter. It arrived one rainy morning, sealed in white. The handwriting was hers. Inside, just a few lines. "Ethan, please don't come to see me. Father is arranging something I can't fight anymore. I'll always be grateful for what we had. Please forgive me." I sat there, reading those words again and again until the ink began to blur. That's how love ends sometimes. Not in shouting, not in anger, but in quiet surrender. I went to the Harrington mansion one last time. The gates were locked. The guards told me there was an engagement announcement that evening, private, for family only. And that's when I understood. Mr. Harrington hadn't tried to change my life for my sake. He had built a wall high enough to keep me out, and he had used my own ambition as the bricks. He wanted to prove that no matter how hard I worked, I would never be one of them. That night, I stood outside in the rain, watching the lights flicker inside the mansion. Through the tall windows, I saw Isabella standing beside her father, her hands folded in front of her. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't crying either. It was as if she had accepted her fate, and I was no longer part of it. For weeks after that, I tried to forget her. I buried myself in work, in silence, in anything that would stop me from thinking. But love doesn't fade that easily. It lingers in smells, in sounds, in the way the rain touches your face and makes you remember everything you're trying to forget. And when the invitation came, I almost laughed. A letter, embossed in gold. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Isabella Harrington and Mr. Nathan Cole." At the bottom was a name I hadn't expected to see. Mr. Ethan Cole, best man. Invited by Mr. Harrington. My father's name was also Nathan Cole. It wasn't coincidence. It was a message. The morning of the wedding felt like another world. Amsterdam was covered in soft fog. The canals looked like silver threads stretching into nowhere. I remember walking toward the church, not knowing why I was even going. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the hope that it was all some terrible misunderstanding. The invitation had said Mr. Ethan Cole, best man, and though I hadn't spoken to my father in years, his name written beside Isabella's was enough to make my chest tighten. My father, Nathan Cole, had been many things: charming, ambitious, and in his own way, ruthless. He built his wealth by taking risks, the kind that either made you rich or broke. When I was younger, he'd always said, "Love slows you down, Ethan. In this world, you either chase money or you get left behind." It wasn't until I grew older that I realized he'd chosen money over everything, including family. He and my mother divorced when I was 10. I stayed with her. He remarried twice. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. So when I saw his name tied to Isabella's wedding, I couldn't understand. Was it coincidence or something darker? The church stood at the edge of the old canal district, small, elegant, timeless. White flowers framed the doors, and soft organ music floated through the air. Guests arrived in expensive suits and jeweled gowns, their laughter echoing like distant bells. Inside, everything glowed with quiet luxury: ivory candles, golden ribbons, rows of polished pews. It was the kind of wedding you only saw in magazines. And there, standing near the altar, was Isabella. She looked ethereal, her dress flowing like mist, her veil catching the faint morning light. But her face, it wasn't joy I saw there. It was stillness, the kind that hides pain. And beside her stood my father, the groom. My feet froze. The sound of my own heartbeat drowned out the music. I could barely breathe. For a second, the world tilted, and I thought I might collapse right there in the aisle. People turned to look at me, smiling, unaware of the story unfolding behind their perfect ceremony. My father's eyes met mine. There was no guilt, no apology. Only that familiar glint, pride mixed with power. Mr. Harrington walked toward me, his face calm as ever. "I see you got the invitation," he said quietly. I couldn't speak. My lips parted, but no words came out. He leaned closer, his voice almost kind. "You wanted to give her a future. Now you can say she has one." I stared at him, every muscle in my body trembling. "You planned this?" He straightened his tie. "Love is a fragile illusion, Ethan. I simply replaced it with something permanent." My father approached, extending his hand as though nothing had happened. "Son," he said with that rehearsed smile, "it's been a long time." I didn't take his hand. "How could you?" I whispered. He shrugged slightly. "Business brought us together, not fate. Mr. Harrington and I have been negotiating for months. A merger, steel, and construction. This marriage seals it." He smiled faintly. "You should be proud. She's a fine woman." "Proud," I repeated. My voice cracked, soft but sharp. "You took the woman I loved and turned her into a deal." He sighed, as if I were a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "Love fades, Ethan. Power endures. You'll understand one day." I wanted to shout, to tear the whole ceremony apart. But then I looked at Isabella. She stood there, pale and motionless, her eyes wet but empty. And in that moment, I realized she was as much a victim as I was. She had chosen silence not because she didn't care, but because she was trapped. The priest's voice began to echo through the church, calling everyone to take their seats. I couldn't move. My hands trembled. People assumed I was emotional because I was the best man. They didn't know I was watching my world end quietly, politely, inside a church filled with music and lies. When the ceremony began, I stayed at the back. My father's vows were smooth, perfect, rehearsed. He spoke of destiny, of unity, of two families becoming one. Mr. Harrington watched, pleased, and Isabella, when it was her turn, her voice faltered. Her hands shook so slightly that only I could see it. But she said the words, "Anyway, I do." It felt like the air left my lungs. The bells began to ring, soft and elegant, like whispers of congratulations. Everyone clapped. And I just stood there, frozen, trying to remember how to breathe. After the ceremony, I stepped outside into the gray light. The canal shimmered faintly, and the cold air felt heavier than ever. That's when I heard a soft voice behind me. "Ethan." I turned. Isabella stood a few feet away, still in her wedding dress, her eyes red from crying. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I thought I was invited," I said quietly. "I didn't know." My throat tightened. I didn't know it was him. She closed her eyes, a single tear falling down her cheek. "I wanted to tell you. I tried. But my father," her voice broke. "He said, if I refused, he'd destroy your life. He'd ruin the bookstore. Take everything you ever worked for." I stepped closer, but she took a small step back, holding her veil like a fragile shield. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "You don't know how many nights I cried, wishing you'd just hate me so it would hurt less." I shook my head. "I could never hate you." For a moment, silence wrapped around us, the kind of silence that only comes when love has nowhere left to go. She looked down at her ring, then at me. "He told me love was a weakness." "But when I see you, I think maybe he's wrong. Maybe love isn't weak. Maybe people are just too afraid to live by it." Before I could answer, a black car pulled up to the curb. Mr. Harrington stepped out, expressionless. "It's time," he said. She looked at me one last time, eyes full of everything she couldn't say, and then she turned away, walking toward her father and my own. Two powerful men, one broken woman, and me, the ghost of everything they buried beneath their success. That night, I walked through the empty streets of Amsterdam. The rain came down gently, soaking my clothes, my thoughts, my soul. I passed the bookstore where we first met. The lights were off. The windows still had the old sign I'd painted by hand. "Stories are where hearts learn to live." I sat on the steps outside and finally cried. Not loudly, just quietly, the way heartbreak really sounds. In that moment, I realized what they had taken from me wasn't just love. It was in a sense the belief that goodness could win against greed. But somewhere beneath the ache, a small part of me refused to die. I didn't want revenge, not the kind that hurts others. I wanted silence, the kind that grows into strength, the kind that makes time itself your ally. So I left the Netherlands for a while. I went to a small town in Norway, working at a printing press. The days were long, but honest. And slowly, life began to feel real again. I learned to live without expecting fairness, without needing answers. But the world has a way of circling back. 2 years later, news reached me that Mr. Harrington's empire had begun to crumble, a chain of bad investments, legal troubles, and betrayal from his own partners. One of those partners was Nathan Cole, my father. He had taken the Harrington wealth, merged it into his own company, and left Mr. Harrington bankrupt. And Isabella, she disappeared from the public eye. Some said she left him. Others said she lived quietly by the sea. I didn't seek her out. Some stories don't need an ending. They just need peace. But sometimes, on rainy nights, I still hear the echo of those wedding bells, not as a memory of loss, but as a reminder of what I survived. 5 years passed before I saw my father again. In those years, I had built a quiet life. After leaving Norway, I returned to the Netherlands, not to the same city, but a small coastal town near Haarlem. The air there always smelled of salt and rain, and the sound of seagulls filled the mornings. I opened a small printing shop, nothing grand, just a place where people came to print wedding invitations, poetry books, and love letters. I liked that. There was something healing about giving words a life on paper. I lived alone, but not lonely. There's a difference, I've learned. Loneliness is an emptiness that begs for something to fill it. Being alone, when chosen, feels like peace. I rarely thought of my father, and when I did, it was with quiet distance, like remembering a storm after it's passed. I no longer hated him. Hate takes energy, and I'd given enough of my life to pain. One gray afternoon, as I was locking the shop, a familiar black car stopped across the street. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when the door opened and he stepped out, there was no mistaking that face. Nathan Cole, my father. He looked older, not just in years, but in spirit. His hair had turned almost white, and his once confident posture had softened into weariness. His eyes, though, were still sharp, still searching. "Ethan," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching the man who had once broken everything sacred to me. He hesitated before crossing the street. For the first time in my life, I saw something close to uncertainty in him. "I heard you were here," he said. I came to talk. The last time he'd spoken those words, he'd stolen my future. But this time, there was no arrogance in his tone, just a quiet plea. So I nodded, and we went inside the shop. He looked around slowly, running his hand along the old wooden counter. "You built this?" "Yes," I said simply. He nodded. "It's peaceful." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't sharp, just heavy with all the years we'd lost. Finally, he said, "I lost everything, you know." I didn't respond. I had heard rumors about his failed merger, his ruined reputation. the companies that turned their backs on him once his power slipped away. I was too proud, he continued. I thought money could make people stay. I thought power meant respect, but it doesn't. It just makes people afraid of leaving. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I hurt you, and I hurt her too. That was the first time I had ever heard him admit to guilt. It felt strange, like hearing thunder from a cloudless sky. What happened to her? I asked quietly. He exhaled slowly. She left me after a year. Said she couldn't live in a house where love was traded like property. She gave back everything, the jewelry, the accounts, and walked out with nothing. I haven't seen her since. The words sank deep. Part of me wanted to feel relief, another part sorrow. I had spent years wondering if she had found happiness, and now I realized she had chosen something closer to freedom, the same kind I had. My father's voice broke my thoughts. Ethan, I don't expect forgiveness, but I had to see you. You were right, all those years ago. Love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that survives when everything else collapses. For the first time, I saw tears in his eyes, small, hesitant, real. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't need to. Some moments are meant to simply exist, not be fixed. After a long silence, I said softly, I forgave you a long time ago, but not for you, for me. Holding anger felt like living with a chain I couldn't see. He looked down, his shoulders shaking slightly. You've become more of a man than I ever was. I smiled faintly. Maybe I just learned what not to be. He nodded slowly, his lips trembling in a small, tired smile. I deserve that. Before he left, he turned once more and said, if you ever see her, tell her I'm sorry, too. I didn't promise anything. I just watched him go. An old man walking into the gray mist, his power long gone, his pride left behind. Weeks passed after that meeting, and though I didn't expect to, I thought about Isabella more than ever. Was she happy? Was she safe? Did she ever forgive herself for what happened? One day, a letter arrived at my shop. The handwriting was familiar, soft, neat, careful. My heart almost stopped as I read the name on the envelope, Isabella Harrington. Inside, there were only a few lines. Ethan, I heard you forgave them. I wanted to thank you because that's something I couldn't do for years. I live quietly now, by the sea in The Hague. I work with children, teaching them art. Sometimes I tell them stories about a man who loved without needing anything in return. I hope you're at peace. With warmth, Isabella, for a long time, I just sat there, holding the letter. The world outside was silent, except for the faint hum of rain against the windows. It felt like closure, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that softens it into memory. That evening, I walked along the beach. The sky was pale and quiet, and the waves rolled in like slow heartbeats. I thought about everything that had happened, the love that was taken, the betrayal that broke me, the years that healed me, and I realized something simple. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's a door you open for yourself. Because when you forgive, you're not saying what happened was okay. You're saying it no longer controls who you are. A few months later, my father passed away. A stroke, they said, quick and quiet. There was no funeral, just a private burial. I went, not because I had to, but because it felt right. Standing there under a sky heavy with clouds, I placed a white tulip on his grave. It was the same flower Isabella used to tuck behind my ear years ago, laughing in the sunlight. I smiled faintly at the memory and whispered, "You were wrong, Father. Love doesn't fade. It changes. It grows quieter, wiser, and stronger." As I turned to leave, the wind carried a faint scent of rain and sea. And in that moment, I felt something. Not sadness, not even loss, but gratitude. Gratitude for having loved deeply, even if it ended in pain. Gratitude for having learned that silence can speak louder than revenge. And gratitude for knowing that some hearts, once broken, don't shatter, they transform. That evening, back at the shop, I printed a single line on a piece of cream paper and framed it on the wall. In the end, wealth can't measure the worth of love. It became the first thing people saw when they entered my store. Some read it and smiled. Others paused, thoughtful, and every time I looked at it, I felt peace. Because the story that once began with heartbreak now ended with stillness, the kind that only comes when you've made peace with every version of yourself. People often say, time heals everything. But I don't think that's true. Time doesn't heal, it teaches. It teaches you how to live with what happened, how to breathe through the ache, how to smile again, not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer defines you. There was a time I thought love was supposed to end in forever, that if it didn't, it meant failure. But now I know love doesn't always stay. Sometimes it just passes through you, leaving something behind you never lose. Isabella was that for me. She was the chapter that taught me what real connection means. Not control, not possession, but quiet understanding. And my father, Nathan, he was the lesson I never asked for, but the one I needed most. He showed me how easily pride can destroy what love builds, how a man can have everything and still feel empty when no one's heart beats for him.